Ladies and gentlemen, I've heard it said that you should never start a presentation and address with an apology. So I'll ask your forbearance this morning if I begin with two. The first is that intelligence remains very much sub rosa, subject to secrecy, and I am necessarily constrained in what I can say. Now, those who know me know that I rarely read from a script, but words are important. And John's pointed out the sensitivity, potentially, of talking about this subject today, and I need to be precise in both what I say and what I do not. The second apology is that my experience is almost wholly related to the 4.5 years I was directly involved in operations in Afghanistan, over 2 of which were deployed. I have sought input from very learned colleagues, but they're every bit as limited by my first apology and by the lens of their own experiences as am I. So I make no claim that this presentation is anything more than my perspectives on the issues involved, flavoured with others' wisdom. And I would like to dedicate this presentation today to Graham Clark, a man who shaped the majority of today's Australian Intelligence Corps personnel through his experience, through his knowledge, and through his peerless passion for the oldest of professions. My aim today is to provide a personal perspective of intelligence support to land operations in Afghanistan from 2007 to 2014, and I'll touch on the 3 areas that are shown up there on the slide. I will sketch a broader canvas where I am comfortable doing so, but much of the intelligence story, particularly in the sea and particularly in the air, is not mine to tell. In putting this presentation together, I've been mindful of the words of General Peter Cosgrove, who wrote in his biography that intelligence officers should, quote, bring you the facts, their careful deductions, and, from time to time, a courageous conclusion, end quote. I hope I have done the General, Graham Clark, and the men and women I served with justice. There is, of course, history to this history. For Army intelligence, the period leading into 2001 had not positioned it well for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Coming out of East Timor, the Australian Intelligence Corps was heavily committed and understaffed. Additionally, many of the Army's core intelligence capabilities, such as electronic warfare and human intelligence, were the victims of benign neglect. East Timor had seen an ugly public brawl erupt between Lieutenant Colonel Lance Collins and the Defence Intelligence Organisation. This dispute revolved around Collins's reported concerns about pro-Indonesian bias in DIO and the alleged switching off of a strategic intelligence pipeline from Canberra to the field. Relationships were not what they should have been. The organisational consequences of these issues played out during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, forcing the Army's intelligence efforts into what has been described as a decade of improvised and ad hoc arrangements, practices, innovations, and tactical support structures. With this context in mind, and to the extent that it is possible to describe an organisation across 2 theatres and over 10 years, what did intelligence in the sandpit look like? While intelligence operations in Iraq and Afghanistan changed in structure and functional capability, there are 3 generic constants in this framework. The first of these is coalition intelligence support. Australian intelligence efforts did not, of course, occur in a vacuum. Integral to intelligence, from the strategic to the tactical, was the network of international resources which the Army, Navy and Air Force could draw from, be they Five Eyes, Nine Eyes, 14 Eyes or coalition. Indigenous intelligence, often overlooked, had its own strengths and its own weaknesses, and it was also available. of these, in my experience, it should be no surprise to anyone in this room that Australia benefited materially and most from our Five Eyes relationships. The second of these was Australian-based support. Forces in the area of operations were supported by strategic and operational intelligence efforts based in Australia. These efforts served four main functions. They fed the needs of their respective Canberra audiences. They managed the intelligence resources provided into the AO. They provided direction and oversight for intelligence operations in the AO. And they provided support of varying degrees of usefulness to the AO. And finally, there was deployed ADF intelligence assets. Each of the services deployed elements to meet their own unique intelligence needs and to contribute to the joint picture. For example, there were specialist Air Force and Navy intelligence elements protecting platforms and providing intelligence support to their respective tasks, such as counter-piracy, counter-smuggling and counter-terrorism. And then there were the deployed land elements, contributing to planning, contributing to force protection, providing situational awareness through sensors on platforms such as the Heron unattended aerial vehicle, and through functions such as human intelligence, electronic warfare and signals intelligence, and geographic intelligence. Ultimately, this information was, through the science of analysis and through the art of fusion, turned into intelligence by analytical staff. And while driven by the needs of commanders, all of this intelligence effort was basically focused on either fighting the insurgency or understanding the muddled tapestry of Uruzgan's population and its power structures. Now, at this point, I feel it's proper to recognise the contributions made by deployed civilians. Across all three of these areas, civilians provided specialist expertise otherwise unavailable to Army, particularly valuable in allowing our forces to leverage the capabilities of national agencies. This photograph from 2011 shows one of my deployed teams in Tatankot, and as you can see, the people in that picture consist of individuals from Army, Navy, Air Force and the Australian Public Service. I imagine you can pick that particular individual. These deployed civilians fully deserve the Operational Service Medal, and I am exceptionally proud to have served alongside them. Now, in Afghanistan, the majority of my experience was with the operational and strategic intelligence support, although perhaps uniquely, we were involved in intimate support to deployed forces. Now, drawing on the incomparable capabilities of our allied partners, the scale of strategic intelligence support provided to deployed forces was considerable. In keeping with their acknowledged roles of supporting military operations and protecting Australian troops, Defence's three intelligence agencies, DIO, the Australian Signals Directorate, and the Australian Geospatial Intelligence Organisation, all had deployed staff or cells. These deployed elements provided, at least, liaison officers who were able to task their agencies in what was known as reachback support. Each agency provided a unique service which grew in utility over time. The utility was both a product of the significant resources committed and a developing understanding that the prime goal of the liaison officers was to support the deployed Chief Intelligence Officer, the S2. I do recall multiple conversations when, usually anecdotally, ADF colleagues would criticise strategic support to deployed forces. Now, those barbs might include that the agencies deployed people to be seen to be relevant, that the agencies didn't trust ADF personnel with their capabilities, or that agencies wanted to prevent those capabilities from diffusing down into Army. I also remember hearing multiple times that agency liaison officers would run single source reports to commanding officers without telling the S2 in a form of intelligence one-upmanship. Personally, I never saw systemic failings of this nature, and the vast majority of agency staff I encountered were both professional and dedicated. So, why mention something that may be no more than rumours? Well, what I can say with certainty is that the central role of the S2 was assisted immensely by a regular process which evaluated the effectiveness of the supporting intelligence efforts and reported this to Headquarters Joint Operations Command. This held everyone, including agencies, accountable. Now, it was my observation that there was a mostly healthy rivalry between the agencies, although there were times, often associated with particular personalities, when this was tested. I recall seeing a poster in Tarancot on the differences between the agencies. This poster expounded the virtues of signals intelligence and contrasted it with another intelligence function, whose value, the poster said, was represented by a stick figure holding what might have been a weapon and the assessment, there are bad men in Afghanistan. Now, to my mind, one of the most important contributions made by strategic agencies was the provision of actionable intelligence for targeting purposes. This type of intelligence is precisely what it sounds like. It involves a cycle of identifying individuals as insurgents, presenting this intelligence as part of a command decision to target or not, and then providing accurate information to allow duly authorised action to be taken. It is a matter of public record that intercepted phone calls inform decisions on who should be targeted by special forces. Media reports claim that mobile telephones can be located when an emitter is used to mimic a mobile telephone tower, convincing a target phone to connect through it. If the emitter is itself mobile, then triangulation can occur as the platform moves around and measures the target phone's signal strength. It is a covert but deadly game of Marco Polo. In 2001, an article in the Australian Army Journal stated that Special Forces, specifically Task Force 66, had the capabilities and role to incapacitate the Taliban's leadership. The author went on to conclude that the effectiveness of these operations has been significant. Four Corners later reported that Australian Special Forces had killed dozens of Taliban commanders. It quoted an unnamed Lieutenant Colonel as saying that Special Forces missions to target insurgent leaders were provided with very good intelligence drawn from national agencies and ADF sources on which decisions were based. It was claimed that the intelligence available to Task Force 66 often allowed it to find and fix a specific insurgent at a specific location, regardless of their appearance, clothing, or efforts to avoid detection. Now, the Taliban are known to have been aware of these efforts and of the coalition's ability to track their mobile phones at least as early as 2008. This was thought to have been behind their threat to attack cellular towers in Afghanistan, which were not turned off at night, when Special Forces often staged their counter-leadership operations. The experience of General Jim Mollin in Iraq was that US Special Forces, supported by their unique intelligence unique intelligence feeds, played a key part in targeting the insurgency. My experience was that intelligence support to Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan was equally important as that described by General Mollin. And one of my most treasured mementos is a letter I received in mid-2013 from an officer in the Special Air Service Regiment, in which he talked of the lasting impression left by our support. And he noted that, quote, few appreciate its impact, end quote. Overall, I'm comfortable in asserting that in the history of Australian military operations, there has not been a better resourced or more sustained targeting of an adversary's operational and tactical leadership. Additionally, I am strongly convinced that intelligence support to targeting in Afghanistan was tactically and, at times, operationally effective. But in terms of an influence on an ultimate strategic outcome, there is clearly room for debate. The former director of the US National Security Agency, General Mike Hayden, has acknowledged this, saying, quote, "If you radiated on an American battlefield, you were likely to die. Less certain, though, was our ability to inform broad questions of policy." End quote. However, it is important to note that strategic support was about more than targeting. It played the key role in many force protection-related operations, and this is in keeping with the agency's publicly declared roles. One example was the December 2011 seizure of 3.75 tonnes of ammonium nitrate in Zabul. This stockpile was enough to make over 250 improvised explosive devices, the majority of which were probably bound for Uruzgan. Now, in his fascinating but frustrating book, Intelligence in War, John Keegan wrote that all history of the Second World War written before 1974 was flawed. And this was simply because the story of enigma and magic, the breaking of German and Japanese codes, was unknown until that point. There is a lesser but enthralling story waiting to be told about the impact of technical intelligence in the sandpit. Regardless, in my opinion, Afghanistan may very well be a high water mark for intelligence. Afghanistan had a relatively unsophisticated communications network, and the distance between Uruzgan's insurgents and their leadership in Pakistan forced them to use that network at least part of the time. The exploitation of these technological and practical factors was done by very considerable intelligence resources, particularly as the balance between operations in Iraq and Afghanistan changed. I believe that this lucky coincidence of technology, geography and resources is unlikely to be seen again. And second, despite the strain it caused on the limited numbers of intelligence personnel, the scale of strategic support was mirrored by deployed tactical capabilities, which at one time included intelligence specialists embedded at the company level. It did not, however, begin this way. For example, in the early years of our special forces in Afghanistan, there were 6 Australian Intelligence Corps specialists and liaison support from a limited number of agencies. At one stage, the S2 for our special forces was an SAS officer rather than an intelligence professional. By 2010, in the words of a colleague, the intelligence support available to the Special Operations Task Group was a massive evolution by any measure. Analyst numbers had greatly increased. Sensitive collection capabilities had been added. There were more agencies, with more staff, with more capability in the field. And there were Australian specialists in 2 coalition cells in Kandahar. I am aware that these capabilities continued to grow through 2013, creating a truly robust presence. Overall, I'd liken the level of intelligence support received in Afghanistan by our Brigade Minus forces to have been roughly equivalent to what a reinforced division might hope to receive. Now, this was a laudable focus of Defence Intelligence resources on the mission, but I doubt that this level of intelligence support may be relied on in future. And my concern is that the experience in Afghanistan has created a generation of commanders, particularly Special Forces patrol leaders, who may regard the intelligence support they received in Afghanistan as the norm. As long as Australia has the luxury of choosing the extent of our involvement in conflicts, this is likely to remain the case. But if a future enemy removes that choice from us, I see a strong possibility of unmet expectations and consequently of accusations of intelligence failure. And speaking of failures in this period, the 800-pound assessment in the room is the presence or not of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq leading in 2003. Former Director of NSA, General Hayden, again recalls that there was a genuine consensus that there was a case for WMD, but that ultimately the intelligence community, quote, just got it wrong, end quote. In the Australian context, Dr. Elbit Systems' recently released work concluded that WMD judgments were based on faulty assessments and that therefore Iraq was an intelligence failure. Now, I don't propose to go into this further. However, those who wish a more detailed view of Australian intelligence assessments of the WMD threat posed by Iraq might start with Philip Flood's 2004 inquiry into the Australian intelligence services. But ultimately, for me, this begs the broader question of the relationship between intelligence and between decision-making, and the very fine balance that needs to be struck so that the first informs the second without being suborned by it. In my opinion, extrapolating slightly from a recommendation of the Flood inquiry, this is best served when the leadership of intelligence organisations comes from those whose professional life has been spent mastering its nuances, its complexities, its limitations, and its legalities. Turning now to the operational and tactical levels, to what extent did they also suffer from intelligence failures? Or, as I've pondered since I left Afghanistan in late January 2016, was intelligence kicking goals but playing a game of cricket? For me, one of the most striking public critiques of the effectiveness of intelligence was a report, Fixing Intel, a blueprint for making intelligence relevant in Afghanistan. This public report was scathing of the efforts of US intelligence in Afghanistan, describing them as only marginally relevant, as obsessed with the insurgency, and unable to answer fundamental questions which would leverage popular support and therefore delegitimise the insurgency. It isn't just the content of this report that is striking. It's the fact that it was written by the senior US military intelligence officer in Afghanistan at the time, Major General Michael T. Flynn, who of course has come to public notice of fairly recent for other matters. Now, the solutions proposed by Flynn are classic counterinsurgency. Grassroots, community-based intelligence collection efforts which are focused on governance, development and stability. Of course, like all things, there is a context to this, and a debate had raged in 2009 over the relative merits of a counter-terrorist against a counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. It's clear whose side Flynn was on. However, even if one accepts that a counterinsurgency strategy was a valid approach in the Pashtun-dominated areas of Afghanistan, I am not aware that this report changed substantially the way the US approached intelligence in Afghanistan. Now, returning to kicking goals in a game of cricket, I've quoted General Cosgrove and his view on intelligence officers. The General also said that a key attribute of intelligence officers was experience, and he opined that this usually had scars attached. I'll spend the next few minutes discussing 3 scars that I picked up from my time involved in operations in Afghanistan. I'll leave it up to others to judge if these were failures, but certainly they were not successes. The first came from 2 occasions when my team was unable to support operations. One occasion followed the conclusion of Operation Athena and the Canadian withdrawal from Kandahar. This left portions of Route Bear to the south of Tarankot vulnerable, or potentially so, and quite rightly it generated a desire to exert influence along this route. The second occasion was similar. It followed the withdrawal of our Dutch partners from Uruzgan and a subsequent Australian decision to penetrate into the Tungi Valley to the west of Tarankot. In both cases, my collectors and analysts had no baseline to work from. Australian troops were to be committed into what was effectively a black hole for my intelligence functions discipline. Now, while we worked to fill that void, all we could do was inform commanders so that they could take this gap into consideration in their planning. Intelligence training stamps into you the absolute requirement to say, I don't know, when that is the case. But this does not make it any easier when lives are at stake. The second scale was also operational, and it was our lack of success in being able to provide actionable intelligence on arguably the most effective of the senior Taliban field commanders for Uruzgan, Objective Katana. While he was the enemy, I came to regard Katana with a grudging respect. He was a competent and committed insurgent. He was not afraid to leave his Pakistani sanctuary and venture into Uruzgan. Now, the fact that he was able to do so was testimony to his operational security practices as well as to the respect he commanded from the Taliban who knew of his travels. Regardless, an Afghanistan with men like Katana in charge will be poorer by any Western measurement, except, possibly, stability. And finally, there was the period between 2009 and 2012 when the number of attacks by Afghan security personnel on coalition soldiers, green on blue attacks, skyrocketed. As is known, there were significant losses to coalition forces and to the Afghans as a result of such attacks, including 7 Australians who were killed and 12 who were wounded. Consequently, there was an unrelenting intelligence focus on combating green on blue attacks. However, technical intelligence proved to be unsuitable for this task. Essentially, unless the potential attacker associated himself with known insurgents or was brought to our attention by other reporting, counterintelligence, human intelligence, or reports of suspicious behaviour from soldiers in the field, then technical means were only useful, tragically, after the attack. And this did turn out to be the case. Australian intelligence played the key role in bringing justice to all 3 rogue Afghans who fled after their attacks: Objectives Morning Star, Jungle Effect, and Shady Igloo. Now, there is scant detail publicly available about the hunt for Lance Corporal Jones's killer, Shafidullah, although the then Defence Minister, Stephen Smith, acknowledged that intelligence had tracked him to his home province, where he was shot when he pulled a pistol on Special Forces. In August of 2013, Prime Minister Rudd announced that Mohammed Rozi, an Afghan soldier who attacked and wounded Australian and fellow Afghan soldiers almost 2 years before, had been killed. Using what was described as focused intelligence, Australian forces had tracked Rozi from Uruzgan to Pakistan and then to Takhar province in northern Afghanistan, where he was killed. And later that year, the direct role of intelligence in the capture of the patrol-based Wahhab attacker, Hekmatullah, was clear in the description of the operation as a high-tech spy hunt, using, quote, a combination of electronic eavesdropping, human intelligence, and detailed satellite imagery, end quote. Now, perhaps illustrating the difficulty of predicting individual behaviour, the Queensland Coroner's report into the August 2012 attack concluded that there were no indications that Hekmatullah was a threat and that it was not possible to draw a conclusion on his true motivations, potentially giving indicators of that intent for the attack. almost exactly the same findings about indications and motivations were made about the earlier green on blue attack that killed Lance Corporal Jones in May 2011. As I have said, the techniques which were successful in providing actionable intelligence against Taliban leaders in Uruzgan were unsuited to preemptively combating blue on green attacks. This inability to make a contribution to the prevention of such attacks sits heavily on me and is my greatest professional regret. Finally, I don't think that any discussion of the sandpit scars will be complete without acknowledgement of the enduring and terrible psychological legacy it has left on some. In the context of my presentation, I wanted to take the opportunity to touch on one facet of psychological risk that possibly isn't as well known as others, and it's something called vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is what happens when a person is exposed to something that they didn't personally participate in, and it could be through seeing graphic material or listening to potentially distressing material. And the danger of this sort of exposure was first brought home to me in the aftermath of a successful strike against a target. Immediately following the strike, intelligence was looking to assess the longer-term impacts on the insurgent network, and the information collected was graphic. It detailed the physical effects of the strike and the emotional toll that it had had on key insurgents. As the direct result of exposure to this material, a young analyst working for me started showing signs of distress. Over some days, it became clear that this was having an effect both at work and at home, including significant loss of sleep and nightmares and what's known as intrusive thoughts. Now, ultimately, this exposure to the brutality of war meant that this analyst, who was very good at their job, had to be moved to another area. Now, as a footnote, this episode also carried a warning, although a different one for me. When I was exposed to the same material that had caused this young analyst's psychological distress, my reaction was laughter. Beyond any degree of reasonable personal satisfaction, I felt something bordering on euphoria at the results of the strike. It was only when the analyst's reaction became known to me that I took time to reflect on the dangers of dehumanisation. While psychological stress affects individuals in different ways, the legacy of operations in the Middle East will be with us for decades, and care and treatment that we offer our people who suffer must be a priority for government and for defence. So, in conclusion, what I've described to you today is my perspective on intelligence support to land operations in Afghanistan from 2007 to 2014. The story begins poorly. Its prologue is stained by the leadership and intelligence failures related to WMD in Iraq. Its opening chapter features an Australian intelligence corps tired and under-resourced from the years in Timor, as well as an intelligence system whose relationships were not as harmonious as they should have been. However, over time, the story does become one of success. Although the success is far from unqualified, and it is not necessarily synonymous with a satisfactory ending. Ultimately, this is a story of men and women, military and civilian, making a clear difference to Australian operations in Afghanistan and to the soldiers who conducted them. It is a story of men and women who did precisely what their country asked of them and who did it very well indeed. It is a story that, in the fullness of time, deserves to be told fully. I'm very proud to have been part of this intelligence effort as we did our best to penetrate Clausewitz's fog of war and to ensure that the Australian Army in Afghanistan was forewarned and forearmed. Thank you.